Okay, so today we're going to take a look at Lesson 5, The Disciples, from HaYesod, First Fruits of Zion's Discipleship Manual. This is the 2023 edition. Let's dig in. So this is a relatively straightforward lesson, compared to the other ones especially. So the bulk of which is focused on the idea that discipleship is a significant burden, right? Something not to be entered into lightly, as Jesus talks about, right? With the parable of the king deciding if he should go to war, of the builder deciding if he should build a tower. Jesus talks about that a lot. So on that level, I agree wholeheartedly, because that's how Jesus and the New Testament scriptures describe discipleship. It is a big deal. It is hard. It requires commitment, sacrifice, etc., etc. So yeah, that part, perfectly fine. Nothing to say about that part of this lesson. I think the church would benefit more from intentional and serious discipleship. That's something we struggle with, especially as an American church. So in fact, it's kind of one of my observations that it is the desire for just that kind of rigorous discipleship that First Fruits of Zion is utilizing to draw some of its followers away from the church. Is that ironic? Yes, it is ironic that people are buying the idea that you can go deeper, you can do more, you can be more of a disciple, and that's actually taking them from Jesus, from the gospel, from the church. That's very frightening that they would use that, and sadly they do. So let's keep going. Here's the first quote. Yeshua employed the Jewish ritual of immersion, baptism, to symbolize entrance into his school of discipleship. The community of Yeshua's disciples is called the ecclesia in the New Testament. This word is commonly translated as church, but literally means assembly. So we'll return to the idea of the origins of baptism later, because they're going to say more about it, so we'll wait for that. For now, note that the oft-used fable, and I think I thought about what word to use there, and I think fable is the best one, promoted by First Fruits of Zion, that the church doesn't exist in the New Testament. That's what they're hinting at by saying it actually means assembly, not church. So in case think they're being profound somehow in pointing out that this Greek word means assembly, not church, there are many words in the Bible, or really any written work that's being translated. Anytime you do translation work from any language into any other language, there are a lot of words that are going to end up in that translation that literally means something other than the word or the words or the phrase that the translators choose to convey the author's intended meaning. So there's nothing mysterious about that. There's nothing conspiratorial about that practice. That's how translations work. All right, the whole point of a good translation is to convey meaning, not literalism. Let's pause and think about that, right? A quote-unquote literal translation of the Bible would be profoundly difficult to understand in any receptor language. From the Old Testament's Hebrew to the New Testament's Greek, pick any language to translate it into. If you stuck to a literalism, it would be a disaster of a translation. Just think about idioms, right? Idioms are a big reason why, but there are others. But just think about idioms. We don't normally think about idioms because in English, we know all the idioms, right? We know what they mean. We don't even know why we know what they mean or when we learned it, but we do. And this one is a good example. Pushing up daisies. Do you know what that means? Pushing up daisies is the literal translation of the German, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because it's German, and there's a lot of syllables there. Now, in English, we would say they kicked the bucket. In German, they say they're pushing up daisies. We know what that means because of our common, right? Because we speak English. So, some people, right? If you were raised in a different country and you're not a native English speaker, not a native German speaker, if I told you those two phrases, some people would be able to guess that it's talking about death. But wouldn't a more accurate translation make that connection clear? Right? Perhaps even use the idiom that belongs to that language that means the same thing. So this whole talk about literal translations. It's a red herring, it's a canard, it's a waste of time. First Fruits of Zion routinely takes advantage of widespread ignorance. And I'm not calling individual people ignorant. We just don't teach this stuff in school. All right? I know about this stuff because I have a minor in Greek and because I have a major in English, and I taught English for a decade. All right? So, how languages work, that's something that I'm aware of. But they take advantage of that ignorance. Your average person doesn't understand how languages work, and they, grammar, all of that stuff. And so they certainly don't understand how translations into other languages work. All right? And so they employ the trope of the literal meaning when it suits their purpose. They're not consistent about that, of course, because sometimes the quote-unquote literal translation isn't going to help their cause. But they'll trot that out anytime it makes the thing look like the church is hiding something, or the church is trying to confuse you, or whatever. All right, so we'll set that one aside. That was just the average subtle dig at the church, claiming the church doesn't really exist in the New Testament, which of course is complete and utter nonsense. All right, next quote. The Hebrew word for disciple is talmid, plural talmidim. So this word only occurs once in the Old Testament. 1 Chronicles 25:8, young and old alike, teacher as well as student, cast lots for their duties. That's the only occurrence. Mathetes, right? The Greek word that we translate in the New Testament as disciple occurs 261 times, plus 4 more uses in its verbal form, to make disciples, kind of thing. So that's a lot more. All right. So once again, we're seeing First Fruits of Zion claiming that a Hebrew term, a Hebrew concept, a Hebrew idea is actually the controlling definition. That's how we need to look at X, Y, and Z, right? As one in the New Testament. All right. This is standard operating procedure in HaYesod. Recall the debacle that we noted in lesson 2, when they said that the Hebrew hen and the Greek charis are both equal to the English favor. It was a total mess, right? Because, of course, they're destroying the concept of grace in the New Testament by blurring it and making it sound like it's the earned favor that God gave Israel for obedience in the Old Testament. They're not the same things at all, but that's what they did by playing with this idea of the Old Testament definition must be the New Testament definition, even though they're separate languages, even though some of those texts are separated by 500, even 1,000 years, they do that. There's zero consideration here that it might not be exactly the same idea in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. All right. Were Jesus's followers Talmudim, with them. The assumption with First Fruits of Zion is always that there's full continuity between the old and the new, and there's no need to establish it. They're just going to assume that the Hebrew idea, the Hebrew word, term, concept, idea, whatever, is exactly the one that the New Testament writers are using, that Jesus would have used, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I pointed out in this case, in part because the difference between a talmid and a mathetes, it might be small, it might even be inconsequential. If we did a full study, right, of that Greek term and how it's used in Koine Greek, and then how it's used in the New Testament, we looked at that term in Hebrew, looked at how it was used, we only see one time in the Old Testament, but how it is used. But this is a methodology of not letting the New Testament speak for itself. And it has disastrous consequences. Other times it's employed. Again, go back to lesson 2 where they redefined works, grace, and faith by not letting the New Testament speak for itself, not letting the authors who wrote in Greek speak for themselves. So, question, right? Question. Since talmid only occurs in the Old Testament one time, where does the detailed meaning of it that First Fruits of Zion employs in this lesson come from? They talk an awful lot about a Jewish disciple this, a Jewish disciple that. Where is it coming from if this only occurs one time in the Old Testament? Well, of course, the answer has to be extra biblical sources. Some good, some not so good, just it's got to be outside of inspired scripture. So in the end, it's these extra biblical sources, not the New Testament, that First Fruits of Zion will use to define what a true disciple of Jesus must be. And that's the danger of this methodology. They're not letting the New Testament speak. They're using extra biblical sources to define all of the terms and all of the ideas and all of the concepts employed in the New Testament. And says that's what these things must mean. That's what they really mean. But the New Testament isn't allowed to speak. Its context is not allowed to be the controlling way of understanding what the author is trying to say to you. That's just not, again, that's not a good hermeneutic. It's not a healthy hermeneutic. All right, first century disciples could follow their rabbi and watch his every move, constantly learning about the Torah. While we wait for Yeshua's return, we must rely on the eyewitness accounts of his life and teachings, the Gospels. So I got two big things with this quote, right? Number one, Jesus' disciples didn't watch his every move to learn about Torah. Why? Why would they? He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He's the very Word of God. You watch Jesus to learn about God. Right? Why would you look back at the intermediary of the Torah when you have the honest-to-goodness Emmanuel among you? So while your average Jewish disciple might have watched their rabbi to learn about Torah because their rabbi is inferior to Torah, that's not what Jesus' disciples are doing because their rabbi is superior to Torah. He's God in the flesh. It makes all the difference in the world. So this is another example of the diminishment of the person of Jesus, a form of subordinationism by First Fruits of Zion. Again, beneath the Torah, not above it. And that's just not acceptable. All right, keep going. And number two, yes, we must rely, and I like that word, it's the right word, on the Gospels to learn about Jesus. To learn all about Jesus, right? So why is First Fruits of Zion obsessed with pointing us to the Torah instead? We noted that in the last chapter about the Jewish Jesus, right? The Jewish Yeshua, that was the chapter. The whole chapter was about the Torah. Why are we pointing back to Torah when we have the Gospels? If we want to learn about the Jewish Jesus, if we want to learn about Jesus the man, if we want to learn about Jesus the God, right, the Son of God, God in the flesh, any aspect of who Jesus is and what he did and what he taught, go to the Gospels. So why are we continuing to point to Torah? And why do we have a need to rely on extra biblical sources as the lens through which to read the Gospels? We have the Gospels. So I truly wish that this organization actually did rely on the Gospels. We'd have a lot less to disagree about. And not on other non-inspired texts. And of course, I wish they relied on all of the Gospels, not just cherry-picked verses like Matthew 5:17. I wish they actually looked at all of Matthew 5. And I wish they didn't cut verses off right in the middle in order to highlight their viewpoint. So yeah, I agree with that. We have to rely on the Gospels. I wish you guys would. All right, you had to follow him around and eat with him. You had to dress and act like him. In a Jewish context, real discipleship meant radical imitation of one's teacher in every aspect of life. Okay, so given that the Jewish context is inherently the correct one in First Fruits of Zion's framework, everything they say and do is based on that idea that the Jewish context is the proper, correct, necessary one, right? I mean, that's the mission of their organization. So this becomes a not very subtle endorsement of full Torah observance by Jew and Gentile alike. I know that one law is officially typo, kaput with First Fruits of Zion, right? We're done with one law. We left one law behind, way back in the day. Its rationale remains. If you tell people that real discipleship is radical imitation of one's teacher in every aspect of life, then Gentiles are going to say, well, then I need to keep kosher, and I need to keep the Sabbath, and I need to dress like a Jew, right? I need to celebrate the festivals. I need to do exactly everything that Jesus did, just the way Jesus did. Maybe I even need to wear sandals, right? Et cetera, right? I can't. That's what people are going to do. So don't tell me you're not one law, you're not Hebrew roots when you say stuff like this. This is the 2023 edition. They're still teaching that real discipleship, these words matter, real discipleship is radical imitation. But of course, it's just not. So stop and think for a minute. Perhaps rote copying isn't the best way to be a disciple. I know. Blow your mind, but maybe the way that these disciples, these Jewish disciples, were following their rabbis in the first century, maybe it wasn't the best way. Maybe talking and eating and dressing just like them wasn't the best form of discipleship. And I know that First Fruits of Zion assumes that whatever Second Temple Judaism did in the first century, it's got to be normative, right? I mean, this is what we must do. But in this case, that kind of discipleship is a dead-end street. This doesn't lead anywhere. What copying mannerisms and style does is freeze discipleship into, and here's the key, human cultural expressions. It's just like Islam. In Islam is frozen in much of it in 6th and 7th century Arab cultural expressions. Why do they dress this way? Why do they do these things? Because Muhammad did them. And we got to act like him. So it's frozen in time. Is that really what true discipleship of Jesus is? To freeze cultural expression in 1st century Judaism. So, First Fruits of Zion has expressed repeated antagonism toward understanding the spirit of the commands of God and seeking to apply them in the diverse circumstances with wisdom that we live in, right? They think that's a very bad idea, that you would say, what's the spirit behind this law? What did God want me to learn and understand so I can apply it to my circumstances that are not the same as these ones in the Bible? Right? They prefer to rely on literal obedience. And again, the use of literal there is not the right use of the term, but they like the word. I got a video, I made a video on the beginning of wisdom, lesson 48, where they are ripping into the church for seeking the wisdom in Old Testament law rather than literal obedience. They call that the way of Solomon. It's basically the way of sin in their expression. But this path that they are advocating here, this rote, right, copying, is actually the path of legalistic fundamentalism. I know that's ironic, right? Given how much Daniel and Jacob in particular seem to be reacting against that upbringing, seem to be rejecting the way they were raised, the faith they were raised with. I mean, Jacob went to liberty. Daniel talks about his upbringing like it was a very fundamentalist kind of thing that his dad was preaching. And so they're reacting against it, seemingly, by circling back around to it. This is what people do. This is a very human answer. So even though First Fruits of Zion's ideas are radical and ever-changing now, right? Right now, they've changed their mind like 4 times about what Gentiles are supposed to do over the last 30 years, all right? So it seems like pick a lane, right? Stop changing. Well, if you give them time, and I'm talking like 3 generations, like 100 years, right? This methodology that they're talking about, this true discipleship, is going to likely result in calcified, in other words, frozen, dogmatic adherence to the particular expressions of Torah observance of this movement's founder. In other words, 100 years from now, people are going to be saying, we've got to live and act and speak and dress and all of that just like Boaz Michael, because that's what true discipleship is. Again, it's my hunch that if this group is still around and there's still people following it 100 years from now, that's what it's going to be like. Because that's your definition of true discipleship, is imitation. So regardless of what type of baptism you might prefer, all of them originate in a simple Jewish purification ritual, and then all forms of Christian baptism derive from Jewish ritual immersion. All right, so we're talking about baptism again, right? So the origins, meaning, and purpose of Christian baptism are much too big a topic for this short video. I mean, that's a good length book to explain all of that and talk about all of that. Suffice it to say, right, while John the Baptist and Jesus are certainly utilizing the existing cultural expression of ritualistic washing, right? That's an idea that is not unique to the Jewish people in the ancient Near East. Other people did ritualistic washing. Again, that's exactly what we see in the Law of Moses. God using cultural expressions of the ancient Near East, ones that some of their neighbors were doing, and gives them his own meaning, his own purpose. So it's not a surprise at all that Jesus and John the Baptist would utilize ritualistic washing and say, aha, you've already know this, let's give it a new, right? A new importance, a new usage. It's not what it was. It's not ritualistic washing anymore. It's something else. But it's a familiar thing that we're using that way. That's exactly what God did with the Law of Moses. That's what people do. It's the best way to help people connect to your movement, to your idea, to your even to your revolution, is to start them with something they already know and understand. So I'm not surprised at all. I have no issue with saying that it has as its origin Jewish ritual purification, and of course the use of that ritual washing in other cultures in the area as well. So there's no problem there, right? Consider where the idea of baptism originated. But its usage, the way John the Baptist and Jesus put it to use, and its profound symbolism, as expressed most eloquently by the Apostle Paul, they go far beyond the ideas of ritual purity expressed in Judaism. All right? The ritual washing in Judaism is not Christian baptism. They are quite different in their meaning, in their purpose. Because Christian baptism is not about ritual purity. It's not about ritual purity at all. All right? Because in the new covenant, we have been forever washed clean by the blood of Christ. The old rituals of purification, including ritual washing, the whole concept of clean and unclean is no longer needed. And thanks be to God for that. Again, I know that First Fruits of Zion will cling to that till their dying breath. The idea that ritual purity, clean and unclean, must continue forever, thereby diminishing the work of Jesus Christ. As if the blood of Christ is not fully capable of making us ritually pure and clean forever. And I simply refuse to countenance that. That is so unorthodox and so sad. All right. They say a disciple apprentices himself to a teacher in order to learn Torah. So that would be true of a Jewish disciple studying under any ordinary rabbi. But what about Jesus? What did his disciples follow him to learn? I just want to pause and let you think about that, right? In the Gospels, why are his disciples following him? What are they trying to learn? What are they seeking from Jesus? Is it Torah? Is he just another rabbi explaining Torah? Because that's how First Fruits of Zion portrays Jesus. Just an explainer of Torah, a champion of Torah. Nothing more. Yeah, not good enough. Not nearly exalted enough for Jesus Christ. All right? They didn't follow him to learn Torah. They followed him to learn so much more. They followed him to learn about God directly. All right. So here's our conclusion, right? This lesson, it just continues the HaYesod focus of uplifting Torah in every context, right? Here mostly by implying that to be a proper disciple, a real disciple, right, of Jesus, one must eat, dress, and act just like him. So the reality of true discipleship, right, of true, genuine, God-honoring discipleship of Jesus is a matter of the heart and mind. All right, it's deeper and more profound than what we eat or how we dress. So here's the thing, and HaYesod and this chapter are not helping you get there at all. Here's the thing, we need to be like Jesus, not pretend to be living with him in the first century. We're in a different cultural context. We're in a different, as Dr. Walton would call it, a different cultural river. So the way in which we live as disciples is not going to look exactly like a first century Jewish follower of Jesus, because our context is different. So to be a true, genuine, God-honoring disciple means to be like Jesus in your attitude, in your thoughts, in your words, in your heart. Right? Jesus talked with the woman at the well. Jesus touched the leper, right? All of these different ways in which Jesus acted. And you say, okay, who's the woman in the well in my context? Who are the lepers in my context? And how can I be like Jesus? That's discipleship. Not how we dress and what we eat and our mannerisms and our style. It's the substance. It's the heart and the mind. It's so much deeper. All right, so that was a relatively short one. So as always, let's have a conversation in the comments. Thank you and God bless.